Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, a free site, bettingangle.us, a free site. It's April 20th, 2025. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Let's talk about status. Let's talk about the importance of status. In 1996, the Olympic Games came to the American South. It was a huge moment, right? As you can imagine, being the host country, America was buzzing. This Olympic Games was going to be held in Atlanta. Now, Atlanta is one of these rising metropolises. It has one of the biggest, busiest airports in the United States, right? So this was a coming out party for an emerging city. And during the Olympic opening ceremony, the person picked to light the Olympic torch was Muhammad Ali, right? Let me just point out, as you saw Ali lighting the torch, you realized, of course it would be Ali. Right? This is the United States. We needed a big-time athlete who was iconic. One of the top athletes. Right? And you thought to yourself, you know what? Muhammad Ali fits the bill. Now, understand, Ali was suffering from Parkinson's. His hands shaking. You're dealing with fire here, right? You're lighting the Olympic torch. But they wanted Ali so much that even though Ali's hand was shaking, that was okay. We all understood. Because that moment required gravitas. That moment required an athlete who was clearly an elite athlete, who symbolized the Olympic Games. Ali, of course, an Olympic gold medalist, right? Ali, of course, a great fighter, right? One of the very best. He was the pick. In an earlier generation, it may have been Joe Louis, right? I knew when I was talking boxing with my father, we could be talking about fighters who were modern at the time. I could look on my watch and I would know that sooner or later the conversation was going to swing to Joe Louis, a guy who hadn't fought in decades, right? Because Joe Louis was that big. Even today, he's a measuring stick for many, right? They look at the number of successful heavyweight title defenses. You hear about Lewis fights that took place in the 30s, right? Max Schmeling, that's the 30s, isn't it? You know, it's still remembered today. So just understand, there are moments like that 96 Olympic Games, the lighting of the Olympic torch, that require the biggest of the big athletes, right? Most sports have VIPs. In football, for example, you understand it's a special event. If you see Tom Brady, right? Tom Brady has moved into the booth. You understand. That means Tom Brady is going to do the biggest events imaginable because of all the Super Bowls he was in. You know, I was a little kid, and I never dreamt that the quarterback of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Terry Bradshaw, would still be doing NFL pregame, would still be in the studio in 2025. And he is, because, of course, 4 rings speak for themselves. right? Jerry Rice, Niners, got into a Super Bowl. They had it was a Super Bowl against the Chiefs, right? Of course, they had a superstar introduce the Niners on the telecast, right? Just talk about Niner history. You saw Jerry Rice and you understood. Well, of course it would be Jerry Rice, right? It's either Jerry Rice or Joe Montana, right? You understood the level we were talking about. You saw the chief representative. Of course it was Tony Gonzalez. Because you understood, hey, on these franchises, when you're talking about the very top, folks, it's very few people that you pick from. Now, let me point out, NBA, for years, whenever the Boston Celtics were in a big game, let's say they made the finals, you knew sitting courtside, and I said courtside, right at the biggest event, the NBA Finals, you understood that Bill Russell was going to be sitting there, right? Celtics have a lot of Hall of Famers, folks, a lot of them. But you understand that if you had to name the most iconic Celtic, or let's say, we'll shortlist it, a top 3 Celtic in history, you understood that Bill Russell was on that list. Understand, another big name, right? You know it's a special event when you see this guy there. Right? I was watching the Kobe Memorial, and of course, this guy gives the eulogy, Michael Jordan. Folks, all I can say about Jordan is he's in his 60s. His 60s. And he's still, all these years later, selling sneakers. Right? Many of the young kids who buy his sneakers never saw him play live. Right? The math doesn't add up. Right? But they understand. I want to buy sneakers from the best of the best. Right? Jordan is in that category. I was watching an NFL draft. I mentioned the draft that's about to drop. And they had the draft in Detroit. And let's just say I was watching the draft and I knew intuitively, folks, the country knew intuitively, that if you're going to have an NFL draft in Detroit, and we all knew this before it happened, you knew you would see Barry Sanders. Because Barry Sanders is in that category. Right? He is, the best of the best. Right? He's on the short list. Right? I would say Eric Dickerson is also there, right? But let's just say he's right there on the extremely short list of the best. And you understand, even though Barry hasn't played football for years, it's impossible to have a big football event in Detroit without having him there. Right? He adds that extra glow, doesn't he? So I'm watching the Super Bowl. I was watching a halftime show that impressed me. It was Kendrick Lamar. Right now I'm watching a halftime show and I thought, wow, this is pretty dope. I thought, hey, this is happening. This works for me. Then it topped itself, as good as it was. Right? And it was very good to me, as good as it was. The highlight was when suddenly the camera moved. And there was Serena Williams. And you understood again, it was like, oh, of course it would be Serena Williams because she's the best of the best. Right? You want to sprinkle some greatness on the event. You have Serena Williams show up. Now keep in mind, it's not like Serena was a rapper or anything like that. But you understood what they were saying. They were saying, hey, look, this is the level that we're aspiring to reach. Right? So the camera, glanced at Serena Williams, and I saw it. It happened too fast for me. Right? So I thought, wow, was that Serena Williams? So I spent several seconds wondering, was that really Serena Williams? Did they get her for this? And then fortunately, the producer understood there were a lot of lost people like me watching the show. So they glanced her again, and you thought, oh no, this is Serena Williams. So of course, afterwards, someone asked me how the halftime show was. And one of the first things I said was Serena Williams was in it. That's the level of celebrity. That's the level of greatness. Now, my point to you here is that Saul Alvarez, Canelo, is there. He's on that level. Right? If I were watching an Olympic Games from Guadalajara and, of all the great athletes in Mexican history, they had Saul Alvarez light the Olympic torch, I would think that makes sense. Of course it's Canelo. How could you have an Olympic Games in Mexico and not have Canelo light the torch? Right? Just to understand, we are willing to pay a premium. Right? I can watch a very good presentation and you suddenly cut to Serena Williams as part of the presentation, and that just sets it off. Right? That's how it is with Canelo. Now understand, Canelo, when he's fighting, John, Paul, and Peter, makes $35 million a fight. Right? He generates that kind of money. Right? Canelo is the definition of pay-per-view. Right? Canelo can fight a guy who, is up and coming. You say, okay, Jaime Munguia, has a streak going here. This was back at the time when they fought, right? You say, okay, Edgar Berlanga has a streak going here. He's a credible opponent. And understand, Canelo is getting something like $30-35 million off the fight. So let me say this diplomatically. He recently got offered $70 million to fight 175-pound champion David Benavidez. Right now, I think Benavidez is excellent. Right? Benavidez is certainly on my short list of the best in boxing. Right? I'm not here to say that Benavidez professionally isn't a worthy opponent for Saul Alvarez. But understand, and I get that $70 million is a lot of money. Right? I'm sure many of you watching this video right now are thinking, give me $70 million. Right? You're thinking, what would I do with $70 million? I need for folks to understand that Canelo, because of his status, right, isn't doing backflips over $70 million because it's only $35 million more than he would make from fighting, a good young opponent. In other words, Canelo's choice is to take $70 million for a dangerous fight, or it's simply to fight twice to get the $70 million. Right? In other words, understand, it's not like Canelo's thinking this is the opportunity of a lifetime. No, he's already there. Let me point out too that at a certain point, you have more than enough money. At a certain point, you have more than enough fame. Right? Earlier in this video, I mentioned Barry Sanders, right? Barry Sanders is a legendary running back, right? Yards per carry for his career, 5 yards a carry, right? Think about it. This is a guy who once rushed for 2,000 yards in a season. Understand, too, Barry Sanders in college won the Heisman Trophy. Right? You're talking about a guy who was dynamite from a young age. But Barry reached a point where he decided, and it surprised people at the time, he decided to walk away from the sport. Right? He had, money. He wasn't going to go broke. He had fame. Opponents feared him. Right? You knew. That Barry Sanders was one of the best backs you ever saw. Right? Again, the guy was averaging 5 yards a carry career. Right? But for Barry, enough was enough. Right? He reached a point where he said, hey, I don't want to continue to play football. And this is, of course, a football legend. Well, let me just say, Canelo has made so much money. There's so many big money Canelo fights. Right? Canelo's made so much money that you say to a guy, hey, we'll pay you 2x your normal purse. But you've got to risk your reputation. Right? You've got to fight against a guy people like Mike Tyson call a monster. Right? A guy who boxing Hall of Famers with big punches are calling a monster. Right, folks? It's not worth the risk for Canelo. Right now, Canelo is a guy who, you would have like the Olympic torch. What's in it for him? Right? This seems to me like, Barry Sanders continuing to play. Canelo is already iconic. He already symbolizes this era. David Benavidez has a following, well-earned following, is an excellent fighter. He doesn't have close to Canelo's market power. Right? Even though David Benavidez is unbeaten. Even though Benavidez was a champion at 168 pounds and now is a champion at 175 pounds. He doesn't have the list of fights that are in the public consciousness that Canelo has, right? Canelo Mayweather, Canelo Cotto, Canelo Jacobs, the Canelo Golovkin series of fights, Canelo Kovalev, right? Canelo's run, and that's what it is. It's a run through the 168-pound division, right? He shows up, there are 4 champs. 4. During his run, we'll call it a reign of terror, he beats all 4, jumps up to 175, and for good measure, beats the champ there, Kovalev. Right, folks, that body of work speaks for itself. So let me say this. I'm sure Canelo has people around him who are advising him, and, you need to ask the question, is $35 million worth risking the status he has? I don't know how much Joe Louis got paid to fight Rocky Marciano, but what I could tell you is I spent a childhood where if I was on a sofa with my dad and we were watching TV and that old fight came on, my dad would say to me, Rich, turn the channel. right? The Lewis people don't even want to watch the highlights of that Rocky Marciano fight. And keep in mind, that fight featured a young lion against older Joe, right? Understand, Lewis had already lost to Ezra Charles. You and I know Lewis really lost to Jersey Joe Walcott the first time they fought. Lewis wins the rematch, but the first time Lewis gets knocked down twice. Right? The Joe Lewis who fights Rocky Marciano isn't prime Joe Lewis. You heard me mention that Joe is fighting guys in the 30s. I believe that Marciano fights in the early 50s. Right? So Joe Lewis is past his prime. Right? Joe Lewis has already lost the heavyweight title to Ezra Charles, the Cincinnati Cobra, right, for the people in the Midwest. Right? But understand, just think about it. The money they offered Joe Lewis, if you were Joe Lewis, and we're talking about a historical figure in boxing, right? Even now we hear about Lewis, Billy Conn, right? I'm here mentioning fights like Jersey Joe Walcott and Ezra Charles, right? We know some Lewis fights, they are legendary, right? Tony Galento actually lands some big shots on Joe Lewis, who had a Bum of the Month club, and Lewis, of course, then closes the show as only Lewis can. Just understand that when you reach that Joe Lewis, Rocky Marciano part of your career, the incumbent, and that's what Canelo is, right? Forget the records. Let's talk in terms of cultural incumbent. The guy who is the guy you would have like the Olympic torch. The guy who you cannot have a major NFL event in Detroit without including Barry Sanders, right? The guy you cannot discuss an era without mentioning. Right? You understand that $35 million doesn't come close to compensating Canelo for the risk against Benavidez. So Canelo signed a deal with Riyadh Season. Right? Let's talk about what could go wrong. If Dmitry Bivol wins the third match against Arthur Beterbiev, right? And on my scorecard, Bivol's up 2-0 already. Right? I understand officially it's 1-1. Okay, fair enough. But let's say Canelo, who wants the rematch, who claims that he was only at 50% for the first fight. If Canelo fights Bivol again, Canelo has some historical cover. Right? Bivol's a 175-pounder. Canelo, who won a belt at 175, can claim that, that was just a lark. Right? This is what great fighters could claim, right? Roy Jones could say, hey, I went up to heavyweight, but I was not really a heavyweight, even though I won the heavyweight title. Right? Canelo can say, look, I'm not really a 175 guy. I was just there long enough to pick up the title. Understand, if Bivol boxes the shoes off Canelo, Bivol will likely win by decision, which is what happened the first time. Right? Canelo's not going to get knocked out of the ring like Joe Lewis did against Rocky Marciano. But if Canelo fights David Benavidez, who's younger, who's bigger than him, who knows what highlights you're going to get? And unfortunately, the way boxing works is we focus on the highlights. Right? I'm sure everyone here can close their eyes and remember the end of the Rumble in the Jungle. Right? Foreman spinning around, hitting the canvas. Right? We don't remember the rounds that Foreman won in that fight. Right? The problem with, boxing highlights is you look at AJ for all the good work he's done. Right? The highlights you remember are him hitting the canvas against Daniel Dubois. right? If you're Canelo, what's in it for you in terms of fighting David Benavidez? I don't believe that fight ever takes place. I believe Canelo understands who he is, right? He's already, an icon. He's already the guy you would expect to see at the opening ceremony of any Olympic Games in Mexico. Right? He's a guy who is going to be mentioned when you say, oh, boxing. 2014 to 2025. Name me 3 big boxers. Let's say this is Family Feud. Right? And you and I know Canelo is probably going to be the top answer. Right? You and I know 20 years from now, you're going to be sitting down, you're going to see some promising individual at 165 pounds, and then the announcer's going to start talking about Canelo's run through the division. Right? Canelo being undisputed. We even know the disputed fights. Right? Erislandy Lara, that fight. Right? Think about the cover that Canelo has for that. Because Lara has a title today. Right? Janabek said that he's open now to a unification match at 160. He didn't name Lara. He named Carlos Adames. Right? Just to understand the controversial Canelo fights show you how popular Canelo is, because we can name them. Right? I personally did not see Gennady Golovkin lose to Canelo until the 3rd fight. I thought Golovkin beat Canelo the first 2 fights. Understand, people disagree with me, fair enough. Right? But even there, Golovkin's a surefire Hall of Famer. Right? So these are the kind of complementary arguments that people have. It's like talking about Ali Fraser. Right? You understand you're talking about 2 great fighters. So as you have the conversation, Rumble in the Jungle, right? Ali Foreman. As you have the conversation, you understand that you're actually being complimentary. That's where Canelo is right now. So, to the guy who gets $35 million a fight, fighting Tom, Dick, and Harry, right? The extra $35 million to fight Benavidez isn't worth the risk to his legacy. It's just not. You understand? So the fight is really never going to take place. One of the things, too, that gives Canelo cover is the obvious size gap between the guys. Right? Before, the conversation was interesting because they were both at 168. But now Benavidez has moved up to 175. Right? And so, in the comment section of this YouTube video, you tell us, if you're Canelo, do you fight Benavidez? Let me say this too. Joe Calzaghe. Calzaghe retires unbeaten. Folks, that gives him a singularity with people like Mayweather and Rocky Marciano. Right? There are very few guys who, had championship fights. In Calzaghe's case, he fights Roy Jones. He fights Bernard Hopkins. Right? He fights Chris Eubank. He fights Mikhail Kessler. Right? And he survives unbeaten. Now, as I like to say, there's always that young guy out there, isn't there? Right? There's always that Moses Atama in the side of the room who has a growing fan base who says, hey, when are you going to fight me? Now, you had Carl Froch in Calzaghe's country, in Calzaghe's weight class at the time. Right? Calzaghe decided not to fight Carl Froch. Right? He had the cover of them being different generations. right? The idea was, hey, Roy Jones, he's my generation. That's a hill I need to climb. Bernard Hopkins, he's my generation. That's a hill I need to climb. Right? These young guys, they'll sort out their generation in due time. Right? Well, understand, Joe Calzaghe's still unbeaten. That's how he's remembered. Right? I mean, that's how he's remembered. How much could you have paid Calzaghe at the very end of his career after he beat Hopkins and Jones to fight Carl Froch? Right, folks? I'm sure by then, end of the guy's career, the guy is known to the public. I'm sure they could have thrown a lot of money at him. Right? Why take it when you understand, if I say the words, I retire, then I retire unbeaten. Right? I don't have to fight these sharks. So, Rocky Marciano walks away from the sport relatively early. Right? He's in his early 30s. Right? The real story is that he started to develop back problems, and it impacted his effectiveness in the game. Right? Rocky Marciano trained awfully hard for fights. Right? He may have known, hey, look, to the public, I'm a young athlete. In actuality, I've been doing this for a while, and there's wear and tear on my tire. Right? My back starts hurting. It's bulky. That's not going to cut it against Archie Moore. Right? Against this young kid, Floyd Patterson. Against the Ingemar Johannesons of the world. Right? Against the next wave, Sonny Liston. Right? How do we remember Rocky Marciano? We remember him the way we remember Joe Calzaghe, as an unbeaten fighter. Right? Now, Canelo has some losses. Again, it actually helps the Canelo story. Right? Canelo loses to Floyd Mayweather, Hall of Famer. Canelo loses to Dimitri Bivol, Hall of Famer, future Hall of Famer. Right? So let's just say, if you're the incumbent and you have other fights that'll get you your $35 million fee or more, right? That Bivol rematch would get Canelo a boatload. Why would you step in the ring with David Benavidez? Give us your thoughts in the comment section of this YouTube video. Understand, too, Canelo has cover with Bivol. Right? The argument would be not just weight. The argument would be that Bivol just has his number. Right? Vernon Forrest beat Shane Mosley twice. Right? Iran Barkley beat Thomas the Hitman Hearns twice. Right? We all understand that guy who's somebody else's Huckleberry. Right? With Benavidez, understand, the world's a little bit different. If Benavidez beats Canelo, then goes on a run, and there's a lot to deal with at 175, right? Callum Smith, still around. Lyndon Arthur is fighting Anthony Yarde. That fight is going to have a winner. Joshua Buatsi, still around. Certain fighters, Christian and Billy, probably is going to end up at 175 sooner or later, don't you think? A guy trained by Benavidez' father, Diego Pacheco, sooner or later is going to end up at 175, don't you think? Give David Morrell a little bit more seasoning. We might start screaming for a rematch if Morrell goes through a few of the people I've just named. Right? If Beterbiev beats Bivol, a Beterbiev-Benavidez fight would be combustible. Right? Understand, too, you have people like Grovestick talking about how Benavidez would be a threat at any weight class, right? I'm guessing Gilberto Ramirez is going to have to leave cruiser, right? If Benavidez decides, hey, I do want dessert, right? You know, brother's in his late 20s now. How much am I going to sacrifice for this sport? You know, give me the prime rib with the gravy, right? If he decides to gain weight, if his body says, player, we can't do 175 anymore. Sometimes that's what happens, right? If his body rebels and he finds himself weighing 190 and he says, what the hell, let me go fight at cruiser, right? Benavidez, J. Opataya. Interesting fight. Opataya would be on his back foot. He's faster than Benavidez, right? You know, Chris Billum-Smith, who's still around. That would be interesting. Keep in mind, cruiser, some dangerous people have left. Richard Riakporhe, gone. Lawrence Okoli, gone. Right? Maybe there's an opening. People leave. Maybe there's an opening. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. To sum up, $70 million is not enough. Understand, when you're trying to use money to convince a wealthy athlete with legacy to take a fight, that's going to be an uphill experience. Right? You know, the wealthy guy could say, hey, you know, we're doing okay. I don't need the money. You know, plus you're trying to lure him into the ring against a dangerous opponent. Right? If Ali and Joe Frazier knew that the Thriller in Manila would be as brutal as it was, right? Understand how the fight ends. Eddie Futch, great trainer, doesn't let Joe Frazier come out for the last round because Joe can't see. If you believe Ali himself was thinking of quitting at that point. Right? Think about that. Right? If they both knew the Thriller in Manila was going to be as violent as it was, would they have had the fight? Right? You know, how much of their careers did that fight cut off? Those are the questions to ask. I don't think Canelo ever agrees to fight David Benavidez. I don't even think it's a money issue. I think Canelo understands that he spent a career building a Ali-type legacy, right? Our country is having the Olympic Games, and you are the athlete we want to light the Olympic torch during the opening ceremony. That's the status the guy has. Is any amount of money worth risking that status? That's the question. I look forward to your answers in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.